and you've had plenty of decent speakers here this week, is just tell you a bit about what we've been doing on ITV with News at 10 in the past month or so. If you've seen or heard or read about any of the changes in the papers or the spat we've been having with the BBC about audience figures and all the rest of it, I'll just sort of explain some of the context and some of the reason for the changes. There's been no visual changes to the programme at 10 yet, because we wanted it all to be about the content of the programme rather than the look of the programme. But I won't be giving any trade secrets away if I tell you that that will sort of change in the new year. And you never know, News at 10 might go back to that historic opening that it always had for many, many years, which was flying down the River Thames and up to Big Ben. But you can only reinvent the wheel so many times, of course. So I'll talk about that, and then we can do some questions if you want, if you've got anything to ask me. As you know, I do politics for ITV. I've done it for quite a few years now. So if you want to ask me any particular questions about the political scene as it is at the moment, it's quite an interesting one with Jeremy Corbyn and all the rest of it. He did interviews with myself and Laura Koonsberg yesterday, and yet again made the headlines today for some of the things he said. But I'll talk about the programme first, then I'll open up to you guys, and it's entirely up to you, whatever you want to talk about. So, News at 10, you can talk about the history if you want. ITV was the first channel to launch a news programme at 10 o'clock way back in the 1960s. And notwithstanding the fact that ITV made that, and I think they'd even acknowledge this now, that historically bad decision to push News at 10 off the slots back in 1997, it's still one of the most recognised brands in news. The changes that we've made that happened since the beginning of October, you might remember we had two presenters previously, which was Mark Austin and Julie Etchingham. There is now only one presenter. That's my former boss, the former political editor, Tom Bradby. But the changes we've made extend to more than just the person behind the desk. It's actually a lot of changes about, it's not just about one man or woman behind the desk as opposed to two. It's about some of the more fundamental changes we've made to the programme. I just want to explain some of those changes and why we've done them, and put some of the context around that. The bottom line is there are still only, in this day and age, two mass audience news programmes. One's on BBC One. The other is on ITV. Yes, you've got Channel 4 News, Channel 5 News, there's Newsnight and all the rest of it, but you're talking about mass audience news programmes that are watched by in excess of 2, 3, 4 million people. They are only on those two channels, and even though we're in this multi-channel world where you can watch on your platforms at home or on your iPad or whatever else now, many different sources of news. If you want to hit a lot of people all at once, there's really only two places to do that. But as I've just mentioned, there's been huge social changes. In fact, we were just having a discussion just now that when I was here in 1997, I didn't have a mobile phone. People didn't have mobile phones, which is just quite remarkable. I think I got my first mobile phone in 1998 and was amazed by the fact you can send text messages on it, which just shows you how far we've come in such a short amount of time. So that's changing the way we consume media generally, television generally, and also news in particular. If you think of what you can do on your iPad, on your smartphone, if you think of how you can now watch Netflix, iPlayer, watch whatever program like when you want to watch it. Now, to you guys, the ages that you are, that's all normal stuff. That's stuff that you're used to. But actually, it's quite a recent phenomenon. It's quite a recent change, and it's also changing the way that I think everyone watches TV now. And that's probably led to a declining audience. For TV generally, audience is slightly sort of declining. For example, you might know that ITV was the only channel that had proper leaders' debates during the general election. We got something like 7 odd million this time. Last time we got more like 8 or 9 million. It just goes with the trend of how TV audiences are declining. But as I mentioned, the BBC at 10 o'clock gets around 4 million. We get around 2 million at 10. We get about 4 million on our 6:30 programme, as does the BBC at 6. They're still sort of big numbers, but they are levelling off. Now, when you compare that to, how pleased I might be if I get 500 retweets on Twitter, or if someone says this thing's been watched on YouTube 100,000 times, it all seems quite big, but I compare it to the millions of people that are still watching news at 10 o'clock at night. It puts it into some sort of context. And I think one of the big changes is that news is no longer a primary source. Television news is no longer a primary source. It's a secondary source. In other words, you've got most of your news during the day from your phone, from your PC. You might have a news app of Sky, BBC, ITV, whatever it might be. You might be signed up to some sort of text message alert system. So television news is increasingly a secondary source now. So it's our job not to tell you what's happened, because by and large, by 10 o'clock at night, you probably know what's happened, but to tell you why it's happened and to provide some of that context and analysis around it, which you probably don't get if you're just quickly seeing 3 lines on a text message or 3 lines on an alert from an app. And I think that's probably one of the key changes and what lies behind a lot of the stuff that we've been trying to do with News at 10. Now, my view is the way News at 10 has been for the last 3 or 4 years, that it's been as good as the BBC. It's telling stories better than the BBC. It's using pictures better. It had better presenters. We recently won Programme of the Year for News at 10 at the last RTS Awards. Mark Austin won Presenter of the Year. But what none of that did was translate into increasing audience figures. So I think ITV sort of stood back and thought, okay, what are we going to do at 10? How can we make it distinctive from the BBC? So rather than doing the same thing that they're doing at 10 o'clock, how can we do it differently? And I've got some examples on here I'll show you in a minute. And I think that's one of the key changes. As I mentioned at the start, we haven't changed the look yet, but what we have done is spent a lot of time changing the content. So I just want to sort of run through a few of the ways in which we've changed the programme and how and why we've done it. The first thing I'm going to show you is from last week, I think it was. It was on a day when the rest of the media, the mainstream broadcast media, were leading on the big story, as it was, of the allegations of doping in athletics. But we sent a correspondent to Greece to do the other big story at the moment, which is migration. And despite, it wasn't new, we all know what's happening in migration, but we got some things there which I think are crucial to television. We got a very good story with very good pictures and very good characters in it. And when you have those 3 ingredients, I think, on TV, it does make for some compelling watching. So this is just the first example of how we were leading on a completely different story to everyone else, because we thought it was the more interesting story.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. There is one sound that arguably dominates all others in Europe this autumn, that of shuffling feet. We don't report on the refugee crisis every night. Maybe we should. We've often questioned what it might be like out there as the nights drew in and the weather turned. Well, if you've ever wondered what it's like to cross a rough sea in an overcrowded boat with your life and that of your family in your hands, it's like this.
In the pitch dark, from a rough sea, a boat crammed with terrified passengers hits land. They've made it to Europe, but only just. They paid $1,000 each to make the crossing, but it could have cost them so much more. One old woman fell onto the beach, clearly distraught. Beside her, a child so traumatised he can't make a sound. Watching from the freezing coastline, you wonder how any parent could put their family through this. Then you speak to someone like Sausan.
We are running away from everything, from danger, from the Assad regime, from Daesh, from everything, and nobody is gonna help us. When we leave our country, that is not a choice. It's not my choice that I leave my country. It's not my choice. I put my son in this risk.
Piece that we ran, I'm sure you could have watched a lot more of it, but it goes back. If you've got a good story, you've got good pictures, and you've got good characters within that story, then for us that made it a natural lead on that day when everyone else was leading on something else. The other thing I think the News at 10 is now prepared to do, it perhaps in a way in which it wasn't before these changes in October, is actually to focus a lot more on foreign news. If there's an interesting story happening somewhere in the world, we no longer feel like we have to justify, well, will a domestic audience be interested in that foreign story? In other words, if it's interesting, if it's happening, then we'll show it. And, you know, we've all heard about what's happening in Syria, the consequences of which you've just seen there. But it's also important to go back and see what's happening in the country from which all these people are fleeing.
From among the rubble of 4 years of civil war in Syria, and there really is a great deal of rubble, News at 10 was given a message today to relay to international diplomats holding peace talks tomorrow. Just make it stop, survivors said. Now, please. Our correspondent Dan Rivers was in Damascus and the surrounding area today.
While they talk in Vienna, they continue to shell in Syria. This is the front line north of Hama. President Assad's troops unleashing a ferocious bombardment of rebel positions. And near Damascus, government helicopters herald a fresh bombardment, said to be over Daria yesterday. Their cargo, so-called barrel bombs, toppling from the sky over this densely populated and besieged suburb. Low-tech, imprecise, but deadly. A few miles away is the battered neighbourhood of Kashkul. Here the regime's crude tactics have driven back the rebels, but at what cost? This is the legacy of more than 4 years of war. Many of these children can remember little else. As the diplomats and ministers try to sound upbeat in Vienna, here, hope is in short supply. Nearby is Amal Suleiman. She shows me the photo of her 22-year-old daughter Ala, who was killed by a mortar 2 years ago.
What has it been like living here for the last 4 years?
She says it's been very difficult and very hard. The mortars used to hit us daily. And you've seen what happened to the neighbourhood. The insurgents came and we were kicked out of this area for months. When we came back, we found our house was demolished.
I think the question you'd ask after watching that is, why wouldn't you be interested in what's happening in Syria when you see scenes like that and hear from people like that? The other change is, and it's a word that's developed over the past few years, is that Tom isn't an auto-cutie, as it were. He's my former boss. I worked with him for 9 years or so when he was political editor and I was his deputy. But one of the discussions he's had when he decided whether or not to take on this challenge of relaunching News at 10 was whether or not he'd be able to have a direct input in the programme. You know, a lot of presenters, and I won't name names here, will turn up, they'll read the auto cue, they'll go home. Tom has a direct involvement not only in what the programme is doing and who's doing it, but he himself wants a personal involvement in it as well. For example, a tax credit story last week that perhaps a political correspondent like myself would have done, and I did for the 6:30 bulletin, but he then came down and interviewed Gordon Brown, who intervened on the tax credit debate, and that was the story that ran on News at 10. So he wants a much greater involvement in the programme all the way through. And that includes some of the VTs as well. He's been doing VTs from Paris in the last couple of days where he's been presenting after the attacks there. There's just an example here of where he'll do a takeout VT. For example, a main package on a particular story. This one happens to be David Cameron's renegotiation that he was announcing last week with the European Union. And he'll do a takeout on a part of that story which requires further investigation. This was the claims that David Cameron made about the numbers that were coming here to claim benefits.
After quite a few examples of governments who have, how can one put this politely, massaged, or one could say spun figures over the last few decades, it is always, of course, worth looking at the methodology. It's not that the figures are wrong, Maybe everyone else has been understating the case, but they certainly were different today. David Cameron's figures today certainly were different. They came from Department for Work and Pensions data from 2013. The government said that around 40% of all EU migrants, more than 220,000 people, were receiving some kind of benefits, either for themselves or their dependents.
Immigrants who came from EU countries and who moved to the UK after 2000 have been paying in far more in terms of taxes than what they took out in terms of benefits. So they paid their way, they even overpaid their way into the welfare system.
And on the overall impact on the public purse, it is worth noting that according to the official independent budget watchdog, the OBR, without the economic contribution of migrants, government debt would be 78% higher by 2062. So that is as much sense as we can make of the numbers for the moment.
Just an example really of how there are so many elements to every news story. Sometimes it requires a little bit of an explanation. That was a cut down of the piece he did. It was a bit longer than that, but the government made claims at the time on that day, and there were new figures that David Cameron announced that a lot of the migrants that were coming over from the European Union were here to claim benefits. And I think part of that story was to try, part of the aim of that piece was to try and debunk that story. You got a little hint of some of the changes there as well in terms of Tom's writing style. There is a new style. You'll be learning it on the courses you do here. There's a way of delivering news. One of the things we're trying to do is just make it a little bit more conversational. When you have a chat with colleagues at home or your parents or whatever, you don't ask them the question, they talk to you for 1 minute and then walk away. That's just not how you have a conversation. So it's trying to sort of make those two ways with reporters a little bit more conversational. Tom himself, who's written books and has been doing quite a lot of screenplays lately as well, has tried to inject some of that style into his news reading. And obviously, you'll know that TV's a team game. Lots of people contribute to the writing of it, and therefore it's had an effect on everyone who writes for the Bulletin, and trying to sort of do it in a different and more conversational style. You heard what he was just saying there about the figures. That's as much sense as we can make of them at the moment. It's trying to be a little bit more informal. This is just an example of something he said about the Office for National Statistics the other day, which rather worried me when I heard it went out. But have a listen.
If you're one of those who thinks this country has enough people already, then this is probably not going to be good news. The Office for National Statistics, a dull-sounding but reliable body, has predicted that our population is due to increase by almost 10 million over the next quarter of a century.
Ask the ONS for an interview. I'll say, hello, is that the dull-sounding but reliable ONS? But anyway, I mean, that's part of the style and what he's trying to do. And I think the last thing I'm going to show you is just that what News at 10 has been famous for since it started was the "and finally." And despite everything else that I've said previous to this point in my conversation, which is about making it more serious, conversational, not afraid to do foreign news, doing the most interesting story, it doesn't change the fact that the "and finally" is still quite important. It's probably the last thing you're going to watch before you go to bed, perhaps. Maybe you'll watch the weather. Maybe you'll stay up and get on Twitter, as you might do these days. But it's one of the last things that you'll see. And the "and finally" is still in the programme, not every single night, but just to give you an example that there are still stories, despite what I've said previous to this, about skateboarding dogs.
And finally, the era of performing animals on News at 10 appeared to come to its natural end a long time ago, and a good thing too. Well, so we thought, but we couldn't let you go tonight without a chance to take a look at the activities of Otto the bulldog. Why? Well, because life is short and sometimes random, and it doesn't get much more bizarre than this. Sometimes you have to wonder. This is Otto, and he's a skateboarding dog. Let me just repeat that to be sure I'm not making it up. Well, he's obviously a dog, and clearly, unless this is the best prank ever, he is skateboarding. And even more random, he's pretty good at it. Perhaps I forgot to mention that this was a world record attempt, successful as it turns out, for the longest board, or the longest board under people, or something. Is this the most random "and finally" we've ever run? Well, perhaps not. There was the jacuzzi rabbit, and the water skiing squirrels, and the weightlifting frog. Where was the RSPCA when you needed it? It's worth noting that Otto's owners must have spent a lot of time teaching him to do that, and it's obviously made them very happy. Don't know what to say. That's it for tonight.
No, it's hard to know what to say after that. But anyway, listen, the and finally is still an important part of the programme, even though, you know, everything I've just told you, we are relaunching it. We're trying to make it different and new, give you a reason to watch in this multi-platform, multimedia world in which we all live now. And I just wanted to give you some of the context behind the changes. There will be more coming in the new year. But if you want to open up for questions now, ask me about anything we're doing there, or ask me anything about the current political scene that I occasionally dabble in from night to night, then feel free. But that's as much as I'm going to talk at you for now. Yes.
How much do you believe that media bias, especially print journalism, has shaped the political landscape in the UK? And do you think that media should be allowed to show allegiance to?
Do I think what media should be allowed? The newspaper media or the broadcast media? Right, okay, so there's an interesting division between print media and broadcast media, and I'm sure you've probably done this in your courses. We're regulated by Ofcom, so that covers ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5. The BBC is regulated by the BBC Trust, although there's some talk at the moment as the government go through this plan with the BBC about whether or not the BBC should also fall under Ofcom's remit, but that's a separate issue. But those regulators are required to keep us impartial. So therefore, I can do a story about Jeremy Corbyn, we can be critical about Jeremy Corbyn, but we've got to be fair, we've got to be impartial, we've got to be accurate. What we can't say is, actually, this guy's a waste of space, go and vote for David Cameron. Yet, as you intimated in your question, the Sun can do that. The Telegraph can do that. The Mail does it every day, as far as I can tell. So there is a difference. No, the background to all that is that the newspapers, because there are so many of them, you're meant to get balance across the range of newspapers. You could say, well, do you? You've got the Mirror over here, which supports Labour, although I think they're having a few difficulties about whether they support the leader at the moment. Independent and Guardian about here. Times, Telegraph, Mail, Sun, all over here. And you could argue, given the reading figures for the Mail and the Sun, there is a real imbalance. And actually, a lot of the stuff I read on Twitter that supports Jeremy Corbyn talks about the right-wing press and how he's getting a bad hearing in the right-wing press and all the rest of it. My personal view, I can't really comment on the newspapers. My personal view is that what we do should always be impartial and should continue to be impartial. I think TV, maybe I would say this because I work in it, is a much more powerful medium than the newspapers in some respects. People trust TV. If you look at any figures, on trust, the BBC are up here, we're here, Sky are here, newspapers are down here, and that's important that we maintain that sort of trust level, that we're right up there. And therefore, what we do, particularly in politics, I think it's really important that we are impartial and we remain so. Yeah. Sorry? How did coming here prepare me? Well, I did my postgrad here, and I was just talking earlier about the fact you don't have a postgrad at the moment because you're slightly reconfiguring the times when they do it. But so I did an undergrad at Sussex, and then I came here for a year to do my postgrad. And actually, what I really liked about the course here, it was very intensive. There was no, there was no waffling on lectures that I was used to in my undergrad course. It was entirely focused on preparing you to go out into the broadcast world and get a job. I think in those days it was called a bi-media course in broadcast journalism. Bi-media, the big thing in those days was about being able to do radio and TV at the same time. Wow. Whereas now I'm sure bi-media is not exactly new to you guys. Previous to that, you either did radio or you did TV, for example. But anyway, so we did a bi-media course here. I left here, I was able to use a tape recorder, as they were then called. I was able to, actually, it's amazing how things have changed. When I first started working at BBC Local Radio, this is mid-1990s, they were still using the reel-to-reel machines, where to make an edit, you had to get a razor blade, as in an actual razor blade, and splice the tape take out the bit you didn't like and then stick it back together with sellotape. It's just remarkable how things have moved on. And this was, I say only the 1990s, but you lot were probably born in the 1990s. Anyway, so the course here was really useful. And I think if you do anything, it's about, if you want a job in news, particularly, or in journalism, you've got to have an interest in it. It's one of those careers that's a bit more like a vocation. You need to be feeling a little bit uncomfortable if by the end of the day you haven't sort of watched a news bulletin or you haven't read a newspaper or you don't know what is going on. I'm sure that's the sort of thing that they teach you here. But those sorts of things I think are really important, because when you go out there is no room for not knowing what's happening in the news. I mean, there's always the phone call from the news editor when you say yes to every question he asks you, even if you haven't got a clue what he's talking about. But generally you do have to be prepared every single day, and I think the course that I did here was very good, and it was very practical and vocational, and the training was excellent. Can I still do shorthand? No. Do I remember media law-ish? But when you start off and when you're applying for your first job, what the editor wants to know is this person going to land me in court? And you have to convince that editor, no, I know my media law, I know I'm not going to defame this person, or have you done for contempt of court, because when I went down to the Crown Court the other day I said something I shouldn't have done, and you've got to prove to the editor that you can do all that stuff and you're competent in those things. Hi.
Hi, as Deputy Political Editor for ITV News, what are your thoughts on Robert Peston leaving the BBC and coming to ITV?
Very interesting, actually, because I was a contender in that process, and as you probably have worked out by now, I didn't get the job. So what's my thoughts on Robert Peston coming here, other than the fact he got the job and I didn't? Look, I mean, I can't compete with Robert Peston in terms of his profile. He has people write newspaper articles about his hair, or whether or not he wears a tie, for example. And therefore, a lot of people said to me, and the people in the, a lot of it was in the press who were going for that job. There was me, there was James Landau, who's the deputy political editor at the BBC. There were others, Kathy Newman from Channel 4, and others in that process. My thoughts about Robert getting it, I think it's excellent news for us. I think he brings a level of profile to ITV that very few other journalists could, which is exactly what we need. He's interesting, he's thoughtful, he's insightful. He was formerly a political editor, by the way, at the Financial Times, and then, as you probably know from the BBC, he's been the, I think, economics and now business correspondent, or the other way around. I can't work out which it is. But I think it's a great move for us, and a lot of it was, as you will have read, in the newspapers. But actually, it was all created by what we did here, because Tom stopped being political editor and started presenting the programme, which meant we had a vacancy for political editor. The thing is, there's something that all of us number twos call the curse of the deputy. When Nick Robinson left the BBC in the summer, James Landau didn't get the job. He was the deputy. They gave it to Laura Koonsberg. When Adam Bolton left Sky a couple of years ago, Joey Jones, the deputy, didn't get the job. And it then fell to me to break the curse, and I didn't either. So that curse is still very much alive and well. And actually, there's a vacancy at The Guardian at the moment. A guy called Patrick Winter, who's the political editor of The Guardian, has just left. One of the candidates for the job is the deputy political editor, a guy called Nick Watt, who is fantastic. You might see him on the Sunday Politics. He does that sort of chat with Andrew Neil every single week. He's brilliant, I think, by far the most qualified person for the job. So I will hand over the mantle to him now to see if he can break the curse of the deputy. Hi.
With regard to the piece of the children, refugees coming off the boat, how do you justify using the pictures ethically, the close-up of the children's face?
It's a good question, actually, because normally when you film with children, you need parents' permission to film them. Now, I think it was probably obvious when they were landing on that boat that there was a TV camera there. It was at night, there would have been a big light on, and the camera was pointing at their kids. I mean, maybe if one of those parents had come up to us, and maybe it did, I don't know, I wasn't there. Maybe if a parent had come up to us and said, please don't film my child, then we would have respected that. On the flip side, I think you can't really tell a story unless you're seeing faces like those. Seeing those children looking absolutely traumatised, it's all about the power of TV, isn't it? You can write those words in a newspaper, but until you see those pictures, as the old cliche goes, a picture paints 1,000 words. I mean, that is really powerful stuff. So I don't know the situation, I wasn't there. Had I been there and a parent had said to me, please don't film my children, I would have respected that. I would have thought that's probably the least of their worries when you just jumped off a boat that you might have died on. But it's a perfectly valid question, because when we go and film in a school, you have to make sure that all the children have permission from their parents to be on TV, which is why a lot of times in news reports you see lots of feet when they're doing reports about schools. And everyone always asks, why are you showing feet? And it's obviously because you can't show faces, and obviously in a playground you can never have everyone facing backwards or whatever. What a lot of schools do now, and I've been to a few recently. I went to one when we were doing a report recently about the universal free school meals that the government might scrap in the spending review next week. A lot of schools have a blanket yes, it's okay for the media to come unless parents tell us otherwise. So they have a sort of an opt-out system as opposed to an opt-in system. But if you're ever doing any filming in schools or with anyone under the age of, I presume it's 18, that's obviously something you need to consider. How it relates to, obviously, beaches in Greece is a different matter. Hi.
What's your biggest achievement as a journalist?
Still having a job, I think. Or still being employed, actually, because every night you think you could balls it up and get your P45 from the editor the next day. So still being here for a start. I mean, some of the bigger challenges in the last few years, I mean, I went to Afghanistan a lot of times when that was quite a hot political story. So I sort of had a semi-defence correspondent hat on for a few years when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister and we were having 5, 6, 7, 8 deaths a week in Afghanistan of British soldiers. It was like a long-running story, and whether or not the soldiers there had enough helicopters, whether they had the right equipment, whether their boots were okay for the sand and all the rest of it. And it was quite a hot political story for a number of years. And I think, you sort of say achievements, but just going to Afghanistan and coming out again is quite an achievement. And it is quite a remarkable place as well. I think on sort of a personal level, the fact, because Tom here was presenting our overnight election programme on the night of the election, and he also he has a programme called The Agenda, which runs once a week on ITV. It's on pause at the moment because they're bedding him into News at 10. But it meant he basically wasn't available for the news coverage for the election, so it sort of fell to me to do that and do the leaders' interviews with Cameron, Miliband, Clegg, and pretty much lead the coverage from day to day throughout the election campaign. Now, if you told me that I'd be doing that when I was here, I don't think I'd have believed you. And therefore, sometimes you just got to look back and think, actually, if that is what you call an achievement, then I was quite happy with that. It would have been a fantastic achievement to be in the political editor, but it didn't happen. So, hi.
You spoke earlier about the sort of TV news channels being more trustworthy than newspapers. Sort of like, how often does ITV get it wrong, and do you sort of like own up to that quite freely?
I'd like to get it wrong, never. Because there are so many checks effectively you go through. They're not obvious checks that you see every day, but just in terms of everyone's workflow. There are enough stories that need, the stories in the running order that need legal, they might be the court stories or all the rest of it. And actually, as much as I say you need to know your media law, most big organisations will have an in-house lawyer, and the buck stops with him, which is quite nice to know. But even lawyers will disagree. I can have a piece passed by one lawyer, and yet if a different lawyer was on a different day, and there is someone in our organisation who we always refer to, oh my God, it's them on today, they'd say, oh no, you can't say this, you can't say that, you can't say this. And even lawyers will disagree about what can go to where and what can't. So yeah, look, everyone makes mistakes. I can't think of anything obvious that we've done. I mean, there's something we had to pay out for recently, was when we were filming in a prison. And one thing they tell you when you go into a prison is don't show the keys. Obvious reason. We showed the keys. And it went out on air. And basically the prison billed ITN for having to change all the locks in the prison. And I don't know how much that was. I can imagine it was quite a lot of money. So yeah, mistakes do happen. You know, you get told these sort of things when you go in, somehow under pressure of the day, and who knows whose mistake it was. That sort of thing does happen. But we haven't been in court for contempt of court proceedings. We haven't, you know. You think of what happened with the Sun and the case with Andrew Mitchell and the when he called the police officer a pleb allegedly outside Downing Street. You know, they've been in court over that because, you know, there was allegations that they got it wrong. So you know, everyone gets things wrong. But if you go into a prison, don't film. And if you do film the keys, don't edit them into the piece.
Because the reason why I ask is quite often on BBC, like you'll see like the presenter saying previously reported on this and we got it wrong. Apologies.
Yeah, well, I challenge you on the quite often. I think you do see it sometimes, yeah, and simple. You know, sometimes because of the nature of the beast, and as I said earlier, TV's a team game, and there's lots of layers. You know, there's the people filming it, there's the people reporting on it, there's the people editing it, there are the news editors directing it. There are many, many layers, and mistakes can happen. I mean, one of the things, when I mentioned earlier about Afghanistan, when we were doing a lot of soldiers' deaths and saying names, one of the things I used to panic about and double-check and recheck was whether or not you've got the right name for the right face, because that's happened before. I think we might have made that mistake before. I mean, how insensitive can it be for someone whose son or brother has just died in Afghanistan and you've named them wrong or showed the wrong face? I mean, that's the sort of thing that I would check and double check, just to make sure that you don't get that wrong. And every so often those little sort of mistakes do creep in. But you know, if you've just lost someone, be it in Afghanistan or be it in a murder or anything, that's a pretty big deal. It's not a legal mistake, but it's a pretty damn big one. So, hi.
The EU referendum.
Yes.
Is going to be a massive story. So how do you like to see it pan out?
Is it going to be a massive story? Did you say?
The EU referendum is going to be a massive story.
Going to be a massive story, yes. Yeah, well, what we need first of all is a date, which would be helpful. We've got, it's going to happen by the end of 2017. Cameron's renegotiation is now underway. He announced, was it last Monday? He did the speech last Monday and said some of the things that he wants, which were never going to satisfy the Eurosceptics in his party, who already think that he's sold out. The reason why I think it's going to be a massive story for a couple of reasons is not often you get a referendum in this country. The last time we had one was, I think, for the AV referendum, which was on changing the voting system back in 2011. And we said we wanted, well, as a country, collectively, we said we wanted to keep the first past the post system. Obviously, you'll know that Scotland had a referendum 2 years ago. Was it a year ago now? I forget. A year ago. Was it last September? And that was huge. I mean, even though we live in the UK, we didn't get to vote on it. That was a big story. So I think referendums are big because it involves everyone in the country. And every single person in the UK will be able to vote on it. And there's something going through the House of Lords at the moment which may give the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds. The government doesn't want that to happen, but the House of Lords are seeking to challenge the government on it. So I think it's going to be a big story just because everyone's involved in it. And the consequences are quite big. Pulling out of the European Union is not a small matter. So I think it's a big decision for the country economically, but it's also a huge problem for Cameron politically. His party's split right down the middle, or actually not quite on the middle. There's probably more Eurosceptics than pro-Europeans in his party. They don't think much of his renegotiation. So I think that the referendum, when it comes, is going to be a real marker in the sand for this parliament. And Cameron's already said that he's not going to stand for re-election in 2020. It could be the point at which everyone says, right, you've had your time now, old boy, off you go, and find someone new, be that Boris or George Osborne or someone we don't currently talk about. So I think it's going to be huge for the country because we're all going to vote on it. But it's also going to be a massive deal, I think, for him politically, and it could actually end up changing the Prime Minister. There's a school of thought that David Cameron could stay in post right up until the day before the election, and then have a sort of new leader of the Tory party 6 months before, if you get that. So say it's George Osborne, he becomes leader of the Tory party at the conference 6 months before the election. Cameron stays on as Prime Minister until the election. That's entirely possible. But what's also possible is that his party would say, right, Cameron, you didn't get us the deal that we needed. You're out on your ear. We want Boris or George or someone else. The trouble is George Osborne's sort of he's so close to Cameron that whatever happens, I think, with the referendum will reflect on him as well, which obviously that gives Boris quite quite a good opportunity. But then, you know, a lot of people say, yep, like Boris, it makes me laugh, but do I want him to be Prime Minister with his finger over the nuclear button? Big questions to come.
What do you think our next step is in terms of dealing with the Islamic State, in terms of the Syria?
I mean, that's a big question, a big parliamentary question at the moment. I interviewed Jeremy Corbyn yesterday. His position is still that he's opposed to extending military strikes in Syria. In fact, he said to me in an interview a couple of weeks ago, he thinks we should even reconsider our current military strikes in Iraq, let alone extend them to Syria. But it's quite clear the government want to extend it. The Defence Secretary said yesterday it's illogical that we are bombing a country and respecting the border between Iraq and Syria when the Islamic State do not respect that border at all and operate quite freely between it. But as soon as Jihadi John, I personally hate that word, by the way, because I think given what he did, he shouldn't have some sort of comical name. But Mohammed Enwazi, I think if he crossed the border from Iraq into Syria, suddenly our Tornado jets couldn't fire a strike at him. You've got to think, is that illogical? Well, the Defence Secretary says yes. Jeremy Corbyn's view, and actually a view of quite a few MPs, including some Tories, mind you, think that there's no sense. What will it achieve to start bombing Syria from a few thousand feet up in the air? What simply will that? How will that progress the situation? So the decision is when the government holds a vote in Parliament on it. And David Cameron's made it quite clear, and he said as much yesterday on the Today programme, that he will not hold a vote if there's the slightest chance that he will lose it. He lost a vote 2 years ago on extending military strikes to Syria. He's not going to have a second one and lose it. He says that will be damaging, not for him personally, he says it will be damaging for Britain standing in the world to lose a vote like that twice. So that's a big issue. Now, as far as I can tell, from the Labour MPs I speak to, there are quite a few of them who would support extending military strikes to Syria, but they're waiting for the government to present a plan to them, and they haven't seen that plan yet. Not just a military plan, but a diplomatic one and a political one as well. So I think the onus is currently on Cameron and the government to actually come up with a plan. What do we want to do in Syria? What do we think military strikes will achieve? And then he can assess whether he's got the numbers. And to get the numbers through the Commons, he's going to have, you know, a fair chunk of the Tories, but also a good number of Labour MPs to support him. Otherwise, he won't have a majority. So I think that's the next process, I think. And that will probably speed up, given those awful things that happened in Paris on Friday. Hi.
Have you always been interested in politics, or is that something that developed alongside your career?
The latter is the answer, because I started in the Westminster Bureau when one of the political correspondents, a girl called Daisy McAndrew, went and had a baby, and they needed 6 months maternity cover. She came back, someone else left, and I've basically been there ever since. So, although actually one of my bosses said to me the other day, she's now the editor of Channel 5 News, which is another programme made by ITN, but she went back, looked at my appraisal from 2003 or something, and apparently I did say in there I'd like to do some politics, so I must have said it. But actually it was something that was, that just happened. I was put in the Bureau as the junior reporter, and that was in 2006-07, and I've been there ever since, or not been able to escape since, whatever way you look at it. Was there a question there?
How well do you think the networks handled the debates last year?
Well, the debates were interesting, and I got into some trouble with my own bosses because I was calling them the debates with an S at the end, and they were saying, excuse me, there's only one debate, and that's on ITV, because the only debate that we had that bore any resemblance to the ones we had in 2010 was the, what was it, 97-way debate, no, 7-way debate, wasn't it, that we held in Manchester. The BBC had the Question Time event, which is the one that happened here in Leeds. Actually, that was the last time I was in Leeds, I think, was for that event a week before the election. And Sky had the sort of interviews with Ed Miliband and David Cameron. So there was only one debate. So when you refer to the 2015 election debates, take off the S, and then that's my corporate bit done. So how did they handle them? I thought they were as fascinating as they were last time. I just thought I was in Manchester for them. And actually, for a TV correspondent, it is one of those stories that just is challenging in every possible way, because the debate finishes at 10 o'clock, and at 4 minutes past 10, you've got to have a 7-minute piece ready to go. And it's the sort of thing that you sort of have sleepless nights about. And how you do that, I could probably bore you to death about how you manage to keep watching a debate whilst editing the debate. Is not an easy process. So how do we handle it? I mean, I thought it was. I thought they were good focal points of the election, but in a way, they didn't do what they did, I think, in 2010, which was dominate the election campaign, and that was one of the reasons why Cameron was dragging his feet right until the last minute, really. I don't know when they did the deal for the debate. It was something like February of last year. And in 2010, there were 3 debates, one after the other in successive weeks. And Cameron's point was it dominated the campaign. You had the day before the debate, you had the day of the debate, you had sort of 2 days after dissecting the debate, and then really only about a day or so when you can go around the country and do some more campaigning. So these ones, I think, were spread out over a longer time frame. And I think the difference this time is we also know when the elections are going to be. In 2010, we didn't have fixed-term parliaments as we do now. But what we now know, the data that we always knew, the data of the 2015 election, we already know the data of the 2020 election and 2025. We're in this 5-year cycle unless they decide to change it. And so his argument was always, well, you don't need to cram 3 debates in one after the other. I thought they were fascinating. You know what, I particularly, apart from the fact that I thought our 7-way was just really good, but obviously a little too many characters on stage, really, to give a real flavour of what each of them said. You know, we had Farage, Sturgeon, Leanne Wood, Cameron, Clegg, Miliband, and one more, who I can't remember. Did I say Farage? There was another one. Anyway, Leanne Wood from the Green Party. And I thought it was quite difficult. And there we go, I couldn't remember all 7, so probably explains some of the problems that we had. The BBC one, by the way, I thought the question time one was also interesting. So that they held it at Leeds Town Hall here. And I'd spent a couple of days with Ed Miliband during the election campaign, and one of the things I thought, he would be talking in a room like this, maybe a bigger room like this, and it would be absolutely crammed, and he would do his speech, he'd get a fantastic reception, he would take 40 minutes worth of questions afterwards. You know, he was very confident he was in his stride. But I think it only became sort of apparent that actually all those people in that audience, whilst they might not have been Labour Party members, they were certainly sympathetic to what Ed Miliband had to say. They were students, they were student nurses, they were health workers, they were local council workers, the sort of people who work in the public sector who might have been predisposed to what Ed Miliband had to say. When he went to that Leeds event here, and a guy challenged him and said, you know, I run a small business, I don't know, on the seafront in wherever it was, Scarborough. When it rains, I've got no work, so therefore I can't afford to pay staff, therefore I need 0 hours contracts. You might remember in the election 0 hours contracts were quite a big deal. Someone else had a go at Miliband for overspending in Labour's years. And it was the first time that I'd seen Ed Miliband get challenged by members of the public. Obviously, people like me sort of used to shout questions at him all the time. But it was the first time I thought that he'd been challenged. And I think he looked a bit visibly wounded when he came off the stage and fell off it slightly and stumbled his way out of the auditorium. So I think the debates were actually interesting. They were nicely spread out. This is quite a long answer, I do appreciate that. But I thought they were sort of, in a way, better than they were in 2010 because they were different formats and they were more spread out. And I think they were more challenging for the politicians. Cameron, for example, did quite badly in that Jeremy Paxman interview they ran on Sky/Channel 4. And yet he sort of came into his own later on in the process and actually, against all expectations, won a majority which none of us thought he would do. So he must have done something right. Hi.
I was just wondering how many Labour MPs you've got currently ringing you up and how long you think it'll be before the situation with Jeremy Corbyn kind of explodes?
There's 233 Labour MPs at the moment. 223 of them don't like Jeremy Corbyn, roughly. It took 30 MPs or 32 or something to nominate Jeremy Corbyn so he could get on the ballot paper. If you might remember, back in, when was this, May, June, he only just made it over the line. He had to go and beg for an extra couple of votes. And even some of those 32 who nominated him then latterly said, I don't support him. Margaret Beckett, the former Foreign Secretary, was one of them. I think Frank Field, the other guy who's involved in tax credits at the moment, is another. So Jeremy Corbyn's support in the Parliamentary Labour Party, in other words, the MPs, is really thin. There was a PLP meeting last night where he was criticised for 2 things, actually. One thing he told, going back to the interviews we did, one thing he told Laura Kuenssberg about shoot to kill. He didn't support shoot to kill, and everything that's happening in Paris at the moment. he said to me he questioned the legality of the airstrike that killed Mohammed Emwazi, brackets Jihadi John, last week. And he got a really rough ride last night, and he gets a rough ride. And Labour MPs say to me, he sits there in these meetings, they're private, by the way, we can't go in. What journalists do is hang outside the door in committee room corridor in the Commons, sometimes listening at the door if it's loud enough. Sometimes actually you don't need to listen at the door because the shouting's so loud. So it was, and last night was another stormy one, and a very difficult one. The thing is, what a lot of Labour MPs do appreciate, whilst they could easily find 40 Labour MPs to challenge him, quite easily, and have another leadership election, what they acknowledge is that the party base at the moment, the people who have a vote in the leadership election, is of a certain persuasion. In other words, they're over to the left. And therefore, even if they challenged Jeremy Corbyn and came up with another figure, say Tristram Hunt or somebody like that, they would put that to the party membership and they'd return Jeremy Corbyn. Or if Jeremy Corbyn didn't stand, they'd return John McDonnell. So I think basically that's why I think Jeremy Corbyn will stay for a time, whether it's to the next election or not. I mean, my money would be he would go before the next election. But one Labour MP expressed it to me like this recently, which is actually quite interesting how he sees the state of the party. And look, this MP is on the sort of what they call the progress wing, so the right wing of the Labour Party. He said what they need is to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn, probably after the local elections next spring. But they can't have the candidate they want, effectively. They need a soft left candidate who would still appeal to this segment of the Labour Party I've just talked about, to take them through to the next election, and in the words of this MP, to lose the election, so that after 2020 they can get a leader who can actually win an election. Now, Labour MPs in 2015 are now thinking about they've already lost the 2020 election and who can we have to lead us in 2025? You know, that probably sits, and a lot of them are quite miserable. You don't need to sort of dig very far or scratch beneath the surface very much to find out that they are really unhappy. But while the Labour Party membership, the people who get to vote in this election, and it was Ed Miliband who changed the rules, remember, I think they acknowledge that they're not going to be rid of Jeremy Corbyn whilst the party membership supports him. And Jeremy Corbyn says in every interview, he did as much again yesterday, the Labour Party is bigger than the MPs. It's those 100,000 odd people who've joined Labour since Jeremy Corbyn came along. But the MPs say, fine, 100,000, whoopee-doo. 11 million people voted Conservative last May, and that's the people we need to convince to win an election. So what's the short answer to your question? Will he stay? Probably not. Will he go quickly? No. Does that answer it?
Yeah.
Good. Yes?
This morning, a BBC reporter broke down in tears while reporting on the Paris video. What's your sort of take on that? Should reporters be showing their emotion while on TV?
What was it on BBC Breakfast or something, was it? Or?
I think so. It was Chris Satchel.
Okay, and he broke down in tears on camera whilst doing a live about...
Yeah.
Right, okay. Well, we're all human. I mean, we should, as professional reporters, be able to distance ourselves from the story we're covering. But as I say, we're all human. I mean, how can you not be upset about what happened in Paris? How can you not be shocked? I mean, I watched our News at 10 on Friday for the first part of that unfolding story, and then I was glued to Sky and the BBC, and actually, shows how I'm finally catching up with the modern world. Twitter was much quicker at getting the stories and the picture than TV was. As you do these days, you watch TV and you're on your phone. Yeah? And for example, the explosion that happened in the Stade de France was on Twitter 20, 30 minutes before it actually appeared on any of the news channels. Anyway, I digress. Can you be detached from a story? You should be, but whether you can be detached from a story, then maybe not. I mean, I was quite moved last night. We ran at the end of News at 10 last night. We ran, don't know if you've seen this Facebook posting that a husband has written about his son. I tweeted it earlier if you want to find the link. And it's just, we are just two now, my son and I, because wife was killed on Friday. And it's the sort of thing that does move you. It really does. Yeah, I think as a professional, you've got to be able to keep it together. I'm surprised to learn that somebody did that, but at the end of the day, we're all human. We've all got feelings, and we all, I think, were shocked by the the severity of what happened in Paris on Friday. And yet, another part of this story is, why did we not give a toss about what happened in Beirut last Thursday when 45 people died? How many buildings around the world were lit up with the flag of Lebanon last week after 45 people were killed by IS and suicide bombings? Almost, half the number killed in Paris. There's a valid argument to be had about why we're focusing so much on Paris. I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on it, but should we focus a little bit more on what happened in other parts of the world? Or as I read quite an interesting article in the Washington Post yesterday, basically saying that people in that part of the world think an Arab life is worth a lot less than the European life, and there's a valid argument to be had there, I think. Yeah.
Obviously, it's quite challenging there for the gentleman who's down in tears. What's the most challenging thing that you've ever had to report on yourself? Apart from Afghanistan, which obviously would be.
Yeah, that's challenging for lots of reasons. It's just logistically difficult, and actually, I remember doing an interview once, and it does come down to that emotional stuff. An interview once with a mother whose son was announced that morning had died in Afghanistan. I was doing the defence brief at the time, and we sort of doing a lot of these. We had actually what I thought was quite powerful. We had this graphic. We called it the tombstone graphic. It's just the name we had, the sort of working name we had for it in house. But basically, it started off with the BBC copied it in the end, but it started off with the most recent death, and then it pulled out to all of those that had been killed in Afghanistan. I think we ended up at, what was it, God, I should know this, but 430 or something, 450 in Afghanistan. And when you actually saw that individual face, then you pulled out to all of them. I thought it was always quite a powerful way of describing just how many people had died. But the mother that we spoke to that day was doing interview. Well, she called us up and offered to do an interview in tribute to her son, and she was just you'd expect from a mother. She just lost her son, or got told that morning she lost her son. She was absolutely devastated. She was sort of crying all the way through the interview. It was really, really powerful stuff. And actually, because it was actually so raw in its emotion, I think we put in the script, she called us and asked to do an interview. We often get criticised for doing what's called the death knock, which is, can you talk to us about your family who's just died? And all the media do that. It's one of the most unpleasant parts of the job. I'm sure if you get jobs in media, it's one of the jobs that you will have to do at some point. It's knock on the family's door and say, excuse me, would you like to do an interview on camera with lights about your son who just died yesterday? That's the nature of the beast. But we actually put in the script that she called us and offered to do it, and it was one of those really challenging. And also, you have to get it right. You have to get the pitch right. You can't just go in and say, the words have got to match the severity of the story that you're seeing. But I think that was probably one of those, because you're sitting 2 feet across from this woman. That is, it comes back to the point we just raised about can you maintain your emotions at times like this, and sometimes the answer to that is no. We sort of answered that question over here. Is Labour electable under Jeremy Corbyn? Well, we'll find out next spring. Next spring there are elections for the Scottish Parliament, there are elections for the Welsh Assembly, there are local elections in England, and there's the London mayoral election, which is quite a big deal, Zach Goldsmith versus Sadiq Khan. Now, if Labour doesn't win in Scotland, and you look everything with the SNP at the moment, it's unlikely. The current opinion polls in Scotland are 60% for the SNP, 20% for Labour, which is remarkable. I don't think Jeremy Corbyn will win in Scotland. Will he win in Wales? Where in the local election, the general election this year, UKIP came third in Wales. They didn't get any MPs, but they came third. Safe to assume they're putting quite a lot of resources into Wales this time to see if not they can, in Labour sort of heartlands, in valley towns like Merthyr Tydfil, they're putting in quite a lot of effort to see if they can get that traditional working class Labour vote to support UKIP. London, Sadiq Khan versus Zach Goldsmith. I mean, it's 50-50 really. I can't really predict that one. Zach Goldsmith's a Tory toff. His dad's a millionaire. But then Sadiq Khan's not a great performer. Labour's a London city. London is a Labour city traditionally. But Boris has held it because, that cliche that Boris reaches the part that other Tories can't reach. But whether Zach can do that, I don't know. But anyway, listen, the context of that is, will Jeremy Corbyn win next May? I think it will be really challenging. There's some Labour MPs say to me comments he made like he did yesterday, and you may or may not agree with them. This is not a comment on what he said, but comments like we should question the legality of killing Mohammed Emwazi last week. It's the sort of thing that goes down really badly with his constituents who think that the guy who cut people's heads off didn't think about their legality when he killed them. Now, look, I mean, these are not my opinions, these are just what MPs are telling me. So is Labour electable under Jeremy Corbyn? Of course, but let's see what happens in the spring. Any more? Yep. Well, our job is to be impartial. We discussed this at the beginning about Ofcom. You know, we've got to be impartial, but equally we've got to analyse, editorialise and contextualise as well. And therefore you do have to sort of stick your neck out a bit sometimes and say, well, actually, that was a bit of a mistake. For example, I remember Nigel Farage in the leadership debates who said something about the NHS. I can't remember what it was. He said something pretty vile in one of those leadership debates. And whilst I couldn't say on air that was vile, I could say you might question the sense of what he did next. Let him say it, and then you as a viewer can make up your own mind about what you think about that. But you know, the bottom line, we can't take opinion. I get loads of abuse on Twitter from people who think I'm either a sort of, you know, Cameron right-wing Tory whore, or I'm a complete lefty who doesn't appreciate the difficulties that Cameron's got to find. You get abuse. You know, now people can contact you directly on Twitter as they can. You get the idea is to get abuse from both sides. Actually, I'll probably get more abuse because Twitter's quite, I generalise hugely here, but it's quite sort of left-leaning, younger, metropolitan. So therefore, you get, I generalise, by the way, but you get a certain view on Twitter, which tends to be from one side of the spectrum rather than the other. But you know, it's my job to question David Cameron as forcefully as I would question Jeremy Corbyn. And as long as you're doing that, then you are doing your job of being impartial. But you've got to also be able to say, not one of the things that's important not to do is say, on the one hand, this, and on the other hand, that. It's quite dull. You sort of, as we said at the very top, coming full circle really, what we're doing on News at 10, we're a secondary source. We're not just telling you what's happened, but why it's happened and what it sort of means. And therefore, I think you've got to be able to, tell the viewer why that's happened and why they might have done it and whether or not it was a very sensible thing to do, without some transgressing on your impartiality, which is important because, as we said earlier, that we've got to maintain that trust that we're up here, newspapers are down here, and we've got to, you know, when people tune in to watch us, they've got to trust everything that we say every day.
Thank you. I'm sure everyone will join me in saying thank you, Chris. That was a really fascinating insight into your job.
I hope it wasn't too boring for you.